At some point, a man stops asking why he feels lighter and starts accepting that he just does. The apartment is quiet. The morning is his. Nobody's adjusting to anybody. And for the first time in longer than he can remember, the day opens like something he actually chose. Not something he inherited, not something he negotiated into, but something that belongs to him entirely. Most men reach this point and immediately feel guilty about it. They've been told they should. But that guilt dissolves fast when the evidence starts stacking up every single morning. This video is about what actually happens when an older man lives alone. Not the version they sold you with the sad microwave dinner and the hollow weekends. The real version. The one where the garage finally gets organized the way he always wanted, the coffee is made exactly how he likes it, and the Thursday fishing trip doesn't require a conversation the night before. We're building the case directly through what these men actually experience day after day, because that lived experience is the only argument that matters here. Let's start with something most men won't admit out loud. The amount of mental energy that goes into reading the room. You wake up and before you've had a single thought that's actually yours, you're already doing a temperature check on someone else's mood. Is she quiet? Is that a bad quiet or a neutral quiet? Should you start the coffee first or say good morning first? It sounds small, it isn't. That low-level scan runs in the background every single day for years, sometimes for decades, and it drains something in a man that he doesn't even notice is being drained until it stops. The man who wakes up alone doesn't do that scan. He opens his eyes and the first thought is actually his first thought, not a calibration, not an adjustment, just what do I want this morning to be? That moment, as simple and ordinary as it is, represents something most men haven't had since they were young, a morning that belongs to them from the first second. And here's what's interesting. Men who start living alone later in life consistently describe this not as loneliness, but as a specific kind of relief they didn't know they were waiting for. Society has a ready answer for that, of course. The immediate response is that this man is damaged, avoidant, afraid of real intimacy, that he's running from something instead of towards something, that what feels like freedom is just isolation wearing a better name. And here's where you have to pay attention because that response says more about the people giving it than about the man living it. The accusation assumes that his inner peace should be measured against someone else's comfort, that his contentment needs to serve a purpose beyond his own life to be considered valid. It doesn't. A man who has spent 20 or 30 years inside a relationship building, compromising, maintaining, adjusting, knows the difference between choosing to be alone and being abandoned to it. He knows the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the feeling that something is missing. Solitude is the quiet recognition that nothing is. These are not the same state, and men who've earned the second one through years of life don't need it explained to them. They feel it in the rhythm of their own days. Think about the small things, because that's where the truth actually lives. The kitchen. The man who's been sharing a kitchen for 20 years has been navigating an invisible agreement about how that space runs, what time meals happen, how things are stored, which habits are tolerated, and which ones require an ongoing negotiation he's long since stopped noticing. When he lives alone, the kitchen becomes a completely different room. Not because it's more functional, but because it's fully his. He cooks what he wants when he wants it. He leaves the cast iron on the stove if that's where it lives in his mind. Nobody is sighing at the counter, and the meal, even a simple one, tastes like something he chose. I've talked to men like this, men who spent decades being reasonable at the dinner table, and then at 62 made themselves a steak at 11ish in the morning on a Tuesday just because they could. And they describe it not as rebellion, but as recognition. This is mine. This is actually mine. That's not a small thing. That's a man remembering who he was before he learned to disappear into accommodation. The pushback here is almost always the same. But doesn't he get lonely? Doesn't he miss having someone there? And the honest answer is yes, sometimes, in specific moments. A man living alone will occasionally feel the absence of company. But here's what that argument consistently leaves out. He also has the freedom to fill that absence on his own terms. He can call his son, go see his friend, show up at the bar where the same four guys sit every Friday. The difference is that human connection, when you live alone, becomes something you choose every time, not something you're trapped inside managing. The version of connection that comes from choosing it freely feels nothing like the version that comes from obligation and proximity. And this is where the architecture of obligation becomes worth naming directly, not in a dramatic way, but as something that operates quietly in the background of long-term relationships, growing slowly the way walls do. After enough years, a man has often surrendered enormous amounts of his daily life, not in any single dramatic moment, but incrementally. Each small adjustment so reasonable in context that he never noticed the cumulative weight of all of them until he was living inside a life that was half his at best. The routines aren't his routines. The social calendar has been shaped by someone else's preferences. The hobbies that mattered at 35 were slowly deprioritized and then forgotten. Living alone doesn't just return free time, it returns identity. The man who finally has his evenings to himself doesn't always know what to do at first because he's forgotten what he actually likes separate from what was available to him. This phase is real. It can last months. He might spend the first several weeks unsure how to fill a Saturday that has no agenda. But then, something shifts. He remembers the book collection he hasn't touched. He drives past the lake and thinks, I used to fish there. He pulls the guitar out of the closet and plays badly for 45 minutes and feels something wake up that had been asleep for years. Here's the thing nobody talks about honestly. The process of rediscovering yourself after a long relationship is not graceful. It's not a movie montage. It's slower, quieter, and sometimes uncomfortable. But that discomfort isn't evidence that something's wrong. It's evidence that something real is happening. A man rebuilding his own internal architecture without someone else's blueprint is doing work that most men his age will never do because they're still inside the comfort of having their days shaped for them, mistaking arrangement for aliveness. There's another layer here that almost never gets said. When a man has lived inside a shared life for long enough, silence stops being neutral. It starts carrying meaning, the wrong kind. Silence in the same room means something. Silence at dinner means something. Silence after an argument means everything. And he learns to respond to it, to manage it, to fill it or wait it out, depending on what version of silence it is that day. When he finally lives alone, something remarkable happens. Silence becomes silent again. It stops being a signal. It stops requiring a response. He can sit in a quiet room and it's just a quiet room. That recovery, small as it sounds, is profound. The ability to be in stillness without bracing for what it means is something most men in long relationships have quietly lost. And most of them don't realize it until they have it back. The garage. Let's talk about the garage because it shows up in almost every version of this conversation. The garage or the workshop or the basement or the back office is the room that symbolizes the man's interior life in a house that's only partially his. It's where the projects live, half finished, because there was never quite enough time or permission or space to see them through. When a man lives alone, the garage becomes operational, not because he suddenly has more hours in the day, but because the hours he does have aren't fractured anymore. He can work on something for 3 hours without a competing agenda pulling at him. He finishes things. And finishing things, actual tangible physical things, restores something in a man that years of emotional labor and invisible domestic management slowly erodes. Men who live alone in their 60s and 70s often describe an almost surprising quality, clarity. Not the clarity of certainty about the future, but the clarity that comes from knowing exactly who they are today. They know what they enjoy, what they don't, what they'll tolerate from others, and what they won't. They've stopped performing a version of themselves designed for someone else's comfort, and that groundedness, that unperformed identity, actually makes them better company, not worse, not lonelier. The men in their social world often notice it before they do. There's a specific kind of tiredness that doesn't come from work. It doesn't come from physical exertion or hard hours or a demanding week. It comes from spending years being slightly, never dramatically, just slightly, not yourself inside your own home, adjusting the volume of who you are instinctively without being asked because that's what the arrangement requires. It happens so gradually that men usually can't point to when it started. They just notice at some point that they've been running at partial capacity for a very long time. Not unhappy exactly, not in crisis, just operating below their own ceiling in a register slightly quieter than who they actually are. Living alone for many of these men is the first time in decades that they run at full volume again, and they didn't know how much they'd missed it until it came back. There's an assumption that older men who live alone are men the world passed by, that they are there by default, not by design. It's worth pulling that assumption apart because it doesn't survive contact with the actual men living this way. The man who raised his kids, built a career, maintained a household, showed up for decades of obligation, that man reaching a point where he chooses a life structured entirely around his own preferences isn't a failure of belonging. He's the only person in the room who did the math correctly. He knows what he traded and for what. He knows what he's keeping now. That's not defeat. That's clarity earned at the highest possible cost. And I'll be direct about something. The men who struggle most with living alone are usually not struggling with the solitude itself. They're struggling with the narrative, with the version of events that the people around them have constructed. The concerned sister, the adult children who frame it as a phase, the friends who assume he must be looking for someone new. What these men feel privately is often quite different from what they're allowed to say publicly without being corrected into sadness they don't actually feel. The gap between their interior experience and what's socially permitted to be true about them is exhausting in its own way. This is where it gets worth saying plainly. A man who is comfortable, purposeful, and content living alone is not a problem to be solved. He is not a warning sign. He is not evidence of emotional unavailability, of damage, of arrested development. He is a man whose daily life reflects his actual values. And that alignment between what a person wants and how they actually live is one of the rarest and most demanding things a human being can achieve. Most people never get there. He has. Think about what that looks like in practice. He wakes up without a negotiated schedule. He eats when he's hungry, not when the household runs. He reads until 2 was in the morning if the book has him. He spends Sunday exactly the way Sunday should be spent, according to him and no one else. He calls his friends when he wants to talk. Not because proximity created an obligation to engage. His emotional bandwidth, the actual capacity to be present for the people he loves, is higher, not lower, because it isn't being bled daily by a domestic arrangement that requires him to be on in his own home. The people in his life often get a better version of him than they ever did when he was living inside an exhausting compromise. The argument that a man needs a partner to live well in old age is built on an observation that has a much simpler explanation than people want to admit. The men who struggled when living alone were often men who never built an interior life in the first place. Men whose identity was entirely organized around their role in a household, who never developed the capacity to be alone without feeling like they were disappearing. That's not a function of solitude. That's a function of having outsourced the entirety of their inner life to someone else for decades. The solution to that problem is not more company. It's the slow, difficult, genuinely rewarding work of building something that's actually yours. And older men, specifically, have something that younger men don't. Enough life behind them to know exactly what they value. They're not guessing. They're not building preferences from scratch. They know that the fishing trip matters more than the dinner party. They know that 3 hours in the workshop beats an evening of obligation with people who drain them. They know how much of their previous unhappiness came from friction they were trained to absorb without naming. And they know, with that specific knowledge that only comes from decades of actual experience, that the life they're living now is better. Not perfect, better. And then there's the body itself. This one is almost never mentioned, but it's real. A man living alone starts to reconnect with his own physical rhythms when he's actually tired, when he's actually hungry, when he needs to move, and when he needs to be still. Inside a shared household, those rhythms are constantly interrupted or overridden by the logistics of coexistence. You eat at 6 hours because that's when dinner is ready. You stay up later than you want because company creates its own gravity. You ignore the impulse to take a walk because it would require an explanation or an invitation. Living alone, a man stops overriding himself. He sleeps when he's tired. He moves when his body wants to move. And slowly his own biology stops feeling like something he's working around and starts feeling like something he's working with. That's a quiet change with a very large effect. There's something that happens in a man when the performance stops, when he's no longer managing impressions in his own home, no longer reading the room before making a decision about his own morning. It's not dramatic. It doesn't arrive as a revelation. It comes quietly over weeks until one day he realizes that he's been himself more consistently in the last 6 months than in the last 6 years. That recognition, private, unglamorous, completely real, is worth more than anything the world's version of his life was supposed to provide. He didn't lose. He found something that the arrangement had been covering up the whole time. If this exploration of solitude changed the way you view the quiet strength of an independent life, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the truths in the history that society often tries to bury. Let's cultivate a future of clarity together. The next treasure of insight will be revealed soon.